We are beginning this Tech Masterclass slightly early because Aaron has the most ridiculous lineup for us. He will be unpacking the FMOD Toolbelt for us in 5 parts. Because this is a pretty technically intense talk, we're going to be taking questions after each section of each of those 5 parts. So get as specific as you like. Yeah. And we'll do our best to answer those through Slido as we go. Sure. Please make him feel very welcome.
Is mic working? Hey, there we go. Excellent. Hello, everyone. Cool. Thank you so much for coming. So I guess just really quickly about me and who I am, for those who I haven't had the pleasure to meet yet. My name is Aaron Edwards. I'm sure quite a few of you saw me last year and had the absolute pleasure to interview Darren Korb and do the breakdown about the Hades music and sound. This year, sadly, it's just me, sorry, but I have some cool stuff to go through. I've got about 15, 16 years experience as a sound designer and composer for games and media, and then a couple of years ago I moved to Firelight Technologies to work as product manager for FMOD, and have been helping develop alter the direction of the development of FMOD, as well as discuss with the local teams and international teams on how people are using FMOD, and it's been fascinating. So what I wanted to do today was kind of talk a little bit about where you are pulling your ideas from when it comes to building audio systems, right? Now, when we're talking about making adaptive audio for games, we know it's like we play a music thing, and then, or a sound thing, and then we transition to another sound thing, right? But so often I see people just kind of adding elements as they go and building these things where it's like, I want this, and then I want that, and I want this, and it's like they're building it as my brain works, hyperactively. But I think what's really important is that we start adjusting the way that we think about these things, and we go, okay, what elements do we have to work with, right? So for example, when you're approaching making sounds for a game, think about what elements you have in the game already to work with, right? You don't need to create all these extra parameters. You don't need to go, right, I need this parameter to control this. I don't need this data value to do that, blah, 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 right? There's stuff we can use. For example, time, right? We all know how time works. Linear or wibbly-wobbly, depending who you ask. But in case of audio, it goes, we start, and then it plays the sound, and then maybe it stops, or it pauses, or it changes, right? Well, the fact that we can dynamically change or adjust things that are happening over time, that in itself is a parameter, is it not? Everybody always goes, hey, well, I want to, adjust these things with this parameter and add this value, but at the end of the day, time is still a parameter. Let me show you how. So, first one, we have this element of music here, right? Okay. Now, we have a few things going on. Now, for those who are not super familiar with FMOD, there's some stuff going here. I might do a really quick skim through of the basics, because I don't want anyone to feel left out, but there's a lot to get through, so I'm not going to get too bogged down. Basically, any of the green markers you can see is telling the playback position to jump to a specific point. In fact, the point that it says in the text. We're going to variation 1, to melody. So basically, it's playing this sting, and then it's going to pick one of these transitions, and it's going to jump to that next marker, and then play the next element. It's just a way to create some variation, right? So if we play from here, we see we jump to the end. Right? So we have these transitions happening. But that's actually not what I want to show. That's pretty standard FMOD integration of things. Excuse the fade in. It looks like somebody's been playing with my session and has added fade ins where they shouldn't have. But regardless, in this case, what I actually want to focus on is the percussion. So this percussion track by itself, if we just solo this track, we just play it. Standard filter percussion, right? But what I've done is in FMOD, we've added a multi-band EQ that's just running as a low pass. And then what I've done is added an LFO set to noise ramped, and then we've used the phase value as essentially picking the pattern that we want, and then we're modulating the frequency of that EQ, right? So basically we're taking that EQ point, and then we're modulating the frequency based on this ramp. Now, that ends up sounding like this. And you can see the current value is the yellow circle on the frequency there. See how it's way down now? Without it, obviously. Now, what we've done is use time as a parameter. So we haven't added in any extra parameters, any extra things. We don't need to go to the game engine and go, okay, program this code, program this line, blah, blah, blah. This is just using time. It's something that we all have access to the second we make a timeline event. Timeline sheet, sorry. So that's one example, right? But then going forward from there, you can then start adding a bunch of different elements. You can then maybe stack time together. You can use transitions based on certain times. There's a bunch of different elements. But before I kind of swing forward, is there any sort of questions on that little element we've just done there? It's supposed to be a little gentle taster, so I hope everyone's still with me.
By the looks of the Slido, people are going okay so far.
Excellent.
So I think you can continue.
Good job. So, we now have a little bit more of an epic track. This one is a track for a battle theme from that same game demo that the first ambient track was taken from. And this one is an example of, again, thinking about time as an element that we can use within the composition, okay? Again, we look at this and we know, okay, it's in 3 parts and we want to jump from A to B or B to C, but we still need to think about the fact that this is still time-based transition. We've got the element of transitioning from A to B or B to C, but we also want to quantize it, right? We also want to go, oh, I only want to do this on certain beats so that it sounds musical, it sounds smooth. Bear with me. So, we have this battle track, which sounds like this. Okay? And we want to transition to this one. Right? So, what we can do in FMOD is we've got these transition regions. Again, I'm going to gloss over a lot of the FMOD functionality, but if anybody's curious to learn more, you can come down and see it at the workshop downstairs, and I'm happy to go through this in as much detail as you want. Trust me, I can go for a while. So, in the transition conditions, when you select a transition, down the bottom you can see we're saying, hey, FMOD, only transition to the next region once we tell you it's okay to do, okay? So that in itself, yes, that's not a time-based parameter, yet. But, so we've got this, and we're saying, hey, if music state is set to 1, that's when you're allowed to transition to the next point. Now, without this quantization, that will just do whenever it's ready to do it. As soon as music intensity is set to 1, it will jump. But we don't want that. It's going to sound weird, because it's going to go from the middle of the bar. In fact, you know what? Let's do it. So we go play. Whoops. All right. Not this one. I did the wrong thing. This one. So we play. Then once we set this value to 1, it sounds like bad. Right? Let's go with bad. That's the word I was going to use. But we want to check this at a certain intervals in time, right? We want to make sure that it can only transition in time with the music that currently exists. So, in this case, just because it's a nice demo and it sounds way cooler, I'm going to do per bar. But you could go down to a quarter note or eighth note. But in this case, I'm just selecting the each bar, and you can see now we've got these green grid lines, and that's just saying, hey, at the end of each bar, it's going to check, am I supposed to transition yet, right? So now it's going to go play, and then as soon as one the parameter is set to 1, it's going to wait until that tick, and then go, okay, at the end of this bar, now I'm able to transition. So we'll do that now. Set 1, let's say, now. Right, get super smooth transition. But now we're using time as a way to check things, right? Again, it's still thinking about things in a different way. This may seem like it's like, well, yeah, I get it, but it's a really important distinction to separate that out and going, well, what do I have at my disposal when I'm creating things? Because that's what we all want to do, is create cool things, right? So why are we there making new instruments? When you want to play the guitar or a piano, you don't build a new one each time you want to play it, do you? If you do, then come talk to me, because that's cool. But don't do that. So in this case, we've got all these elements. Why aren't we using them? Now, just to finish off this particular demo, we've got the same thing happening again at stage 2, where it's got bar checking if the parameter is set to 2, then transition to the next state, and then in the last state, because this particular fight was like a boss battle kind of thing, and it needed to be more of a score, right? We wanted it to kind of feel like it's ramping up, but at the end, when the boss actually died, we needed it to be a lot quicker to react to it. So I've actually set the quantization to quarter notes here, saying if this parameter value is true, then jump to here. So again, we're just using different divisions of time in this case, right? So let's run this again. We'll go from start to finish. Part A. Boss is dead. So with that, we have a pretty fluid transition. We can still adjust how reactive we want any song to be, because we can choose when we want to change the quantized amount, doing it this way. We can kind of go, okay, this part, it just needs to be cinematic. I want it to sound good over being really reactive. Then at the end, no, now it needs to react real quick. So we can adjust our quantization time. Everyone still with me? Questions?
There are a couple. Someone in the audience asks, can you trigger the second audio to start at a certain point in the bar so that it matches with the point in the first bar when the parameter is changed?
Yes, you can. So in transitions, we have a mode here called offset. And that basically says it's going to check at the percentage value that you have completed of this region. So let's say you're 4 bars in of an 8-bar session within that loop region. That's going to be 50% of the way through. So when that jumps to the next region that it's going to resume at 50% in. We actually cover that a little bit in, which one? This one. The next one, which we'll go over that in a sec. So whoever asked that one, next demo has some cool stuff you'll like.
Someone else asks, is it possible to increase the tempo? For example, if stage 2 is 90 BPM versus 82.
Yeah, so that's a great question and something we get asked a lot. So FMOD does support multiple tempos in terms of using tempo markers. You can set different amounts at different tempo settings, but keep in mind that doesn't stretch the audio. That's just a way to keep FMOD in sync with the audio file. So what you would do is you'd render out the music at different BPMs if you need it to be, and then you could transition in and out of that one. There are some caveats in doing that, which is the same with any audio. If you were to crossfade 2 pieces of music that are at different BPMs, they're not going to sync up because they're at different BPMs. So FMOD can't do that either, because it doesn't work like that. Audio doesn't work like that, but you totally can, especially if you have relative transitioning on. You can go from one to another, and it will just kind of continually keep it going. And yeah, some interesting stuff. But again, if anyone's interested in more about that, come see us downstairs, and we can go through some more fun stuff.
Great. There are a couple more general questions here, but would it be better if I held them?
Yeah, I think
to
any of the
ends?
general stuff, maybe we can wait to the break in time exploration.
Right, let's do that. Carry on.
Thank you, thank you. Right, now we have this fun-looking one. So, we've talked about using time as something that is modulating over time. We've talked about checking things per segment of time. What if we were to talk about multiple elements of time? What if we were to talk about having 1, 2, or more timelines running side by side? Now we're getting into some cool stuff. So, we have this event. And this event is taking different elements of a song, different sections, so the intro, build, and whatnot, and I've basically mapped them out into different events, okay? For the purposes of now listening to this, we have intro, and then intro is the intro event, the first one, and that is just playing some things. Don't worry about what it's doing, because we'll go through that. But for now, it's playing some sounds in an event, and that event is being played on this timeline, okay? So we'll play this event's timeline triggers. So we have BGM form that has its time, and then intro starts another timeline, time value, right? So we play, and we have this element here. Now, there's a few things going on, I'll go through. Whoops, all right. So, a lot of things happening in this one, but sit tight, we'll get through it. So what's happened there is you can see when we're playing at least the first intro element, while I was playing around with all the different values, you can see we've got our playback position that's looping in this timeline, but there's also, on the yellow event, there's another playback position. See that thin white line in the intro? That is that event's timeline. It's a representation of where that event is in its current timeline, right? So we now have two timelines running simultaneously, which also means we have two values of time that we can use as parameters as well. So, jumping out of this one, let's just jump into the intro event for a second and have a look at what's actually going on. Because it's not that bad. It looks like a lot, but it's not that bad. So, the first thing is we've got magnet regions. Now, in case nobody knows about magnet regions, they're amazing. It basically goes, hey, wherever the playback position is at any point in the event, if its transition condition is true, so in this case we've got a magnet region called part A, if the transition condition, in other words, if this element microprogression is set to part A, it's going to pull the playback position from wherever it is to the start of this region. It doesn't matter where it is. And that's the way that you can go, you know how a lot of people set up these transition matrices with transition regions going, if you've got take A, take B, take C, and you go, right, I want to transition from A to B, A to C, B to A, B to C, C to A, and C to B. I think I did that right. That's a lot of stuff, and it really is, it looks really messy. You can just have 3 magnet regions and you're done. It's so good. Look them up, check them out, it's cool. Come see us on the bottom yet again. But what I'm doing is we have this magnet region here for section A, then we've got another magnet region for section B, and you can see they're both set to a relative offset, okay? So what that means is that FMOD is going to check at what percentage into this loop region it is, and then when it transitions to the other region, when it takes that magnet region, it will go, okay, that's where I need to arrive. In other words, it's going to check what bar we're at, and because they're the same length, that's very important that the two regions are the same length in terms of bars, it's going to jump to the same bar. And because we have this transition timeline, which is just a way to extend the currently played material and offset the going to be played material, in other words, keep playing what's currently playing and start playing what we want to play. We can fade out the existing source material, and then what we can do is have this. Part A, B. Okay. And B. So by doing that, we've created a way to dynamically blend between two stems or two variations of intensity, but not just by blending in another layer of audio. We're actually switching to a full separate mix. And what's cool about that is compositionally, we now have access to be able to orchestrate it differently. You can hear the difference in orchestration for this. I've got low strings, I've got more woodwinds kicking in, the whole piece just kicks out the edge. Compared to so you could achieve a similar effect using just fading in different elements, but compositionally for me, looking at that in terms of a different linear thing or a different position in time makes me kind of go, okay, great. This is like the next step in the story that we're trying to tell, right? This is that next point in time that we're trying to go. So now we can really ramp up the dramaturgy, the dialogue, the emotion, whichever way you want to word it. And then finally, in this position, we've got a melodic element that we're bringing in, and I've actually got that one quantized to 8 bars. And that's quite a long quantize, so this is definitely not something you would use for quick reactional gameplay, but it's basically a way to make sure that we're only ever triggering the start or halfway through the melody, just to make it a little bit less jarring. Because again, this is more about the story the music's trying to tell, rather than just the reactivity of the elements. And it's important to think about which ones you want, like when you want something to be reactive versus storytelling, right? Of course, they're not always mutually exclusive, but yeah. So, we can go part A. Part B. C. So, one other thing I'm doing here, which is just a neat little trick that I kind of like to use compositionally, it's not as related to time, but still cool, is what I'm doing is using a multi-instrument here for the melody. And what that means is, in this case, it's going to pick, normally it would pick one of whichever sounds we have loaded in here at random, but I've changed the random mode to local scope. So what that means is every time it's played, from when the event starts playing, it's going to pick the first option in the playlist, and then the next time, while the event's still playing, if it gets triggered again, it will pick the second option. If we were to switch it to sequence global, that means it will remember the position that you have in the sequence of the playlist until that instance of FMOD is turned off. In other words, until the game stops. But for now, while it's playing, so it's going to go, okay, play the one with the melody. And then when it loops back, now when it loops back, it's going to pick the second position in the sequence, which I've got loaded here as a silence instrument, which is just, you can right click here and add a silence instrument. That's just telling everyone, hey, just don't play anything this time. So now we've set up a system where we can just alternate between the melody and nothing. A really neat way just to kind of go back and forth. You can randomize it, or you can even set it up to have a trigger probability in the trigger. But this is a nice way to keep it alternating, so it's not just purely random. Right? Then basically for the rest of this event, I've just duplicated that same concept, but over each particular element of the song. There's like, verse, chorus, and whatnot, but in cinematic levels. And what that lets us do is we now have all these different elements of the songs that have their own timelines, right? So the intro has its own timeline, the B section has its own timeline. On those timelines, we have a series of logic that we've just programmed, right? So the logic here is we can jump between the sections, right? And that's the same for the rest of them. That now is an enclosed thing that we can just play, and all of that functionality is inherited by that single event. So now we can grab that, load it into another event, and that parent event, this one, can now just play that and not worry about all of that extra functionality, right? So from this event's perspective, we just press play, and we can move this around. We don't have to worry about jumping back and forth in the position. We don't have to worry about where the playback position is and when it's jumping to, blah, blah, blah. It's going to loop here. And that's why thinking about separating time by events and by parameters is a really important concept to kind of get your head around. It's a bit weird, but powerful. So what that lets us do is if we kind of set another value to auto progress on, which, is a bit out of the scope of this talk, but you know the drill. Come see us downstairs. If we play, it's now each one of these elements is going to automatically progress to the next element within it. So it'll go from A to B to C and back again. But we still get control over what section is playing. So we can go to intro, and then maybe to B, or the build, or the drop, or the lift, whichever one we want, right? Intro, B section, 4-bar quantize just to keep it musical. Part 2, B section. We can override this at any point using the inherited parameter if we want. B section. Music intensity, which we'll go over in a sec. You can basically drive a bit. Thank you. So you can basically drive the entire form of a piece using these different concepts, right? And again, all we did was set up a single instrument, a single event, that you can go from A to B to C. That's it. Then we just duplicated it a bunch of times because I'm a maniac. That's all. Right. I have a feeling there's questions after that one.
There are a couple of questions. One here is, when transitioning from one region to another via percentage, how does it handle the tails in the first track?
Yes. So what it will do is it will just jump from the wherever it currently is to the next point. If you at any point have a transition timeline that you can add, so you can add transition timelines to transition regions, loop regions, and magnet regions. You can either right-click and go add transition timeline, or double-click any of them to add said transition timeline. What it will do is it will continue to play the currently playing element, i.e. the source, and then the yellow region is the destination, which is where you're going. So in this case, if we're going from intro to B section, the source would be intro, the destination would be B section. And what you can do is you can offset when destination starts playing. So we want it to play immediately, but I want the source to continue to play. In this case, it's over 4 bars, just to give it a really smooth transition. Again, this particular demo is not really well suited for reaction or gameplay, but you could totally use it in like a cinematic sort of approach where you wanted the ability just to score a scene but still have it a little bit dynamic in case the editors go and change the entire scene on you for the 4th time in a row. I hope that answers that question though. Transition timelines are a really good way to smoothen things out.
There is a question here that is a little bit more gameplay focused, but I wonder if that would be better for...
If it's related to this, let's do it.
Just a question about having different cues. Like, for example, if there was like a win or lose condition, how would you go about that?
Yeah, so you use the exact same principle, honestly. It was the same thing with this music, the boss battle, when the boss sort of dies, you just have an extra parameter. You can either use a new parameter to kind of go, hey, if this parameter happens, jump over to here. And magnet region is a great way to do that because you don't have to set up these really long transition regions. You can just go, hey, magnet region, snap over to here kind of thing. You can either add it onto the existing parameter conditions, or you can use time as a variable to say, hey, if a certain amount of time has passed, add this element in, which we'll look at in the next example as well. So there's a bunch of ways, but basically just using the same system, you just kind of add on the elements that you require. Maybe it's a win loop or a win sting. Maybe it's a new parameter that you might need to trigger that transition into, but yeah.
Cool. Okay, so I think you're good to carry on.
Cool. So, lastly, we have this guy. And this is the one that I've been demoing a little bit in the room, so if anybody's seen this one downstairs, you'll know this one gets a bit deep, but it's fun. So, to start with, we just have 2 tracks. We have the first one that's playing some music, some strings. We have the second one that's playing a synth bed. That's all we're thinking about right now, okay? Super ambient, bit of a culture shock after the last one, but there's quite a few things happening here, even though it seems like a really chill one compared to what we just listened to. But even now, we have 3 timelines playing just from this. So we have 3 variables of time that we can play with already. The first one, let's just go with the synth not much is happening. It's literally just looping a synth track. There are some other intensities there, but we're actually not using those for this demo. It was for a later part of a demo. But it's basically, looping synth, and it just loops it. Easy. Then we have this, what I've called BGM chunk, and that's where this deep dive kind of starts. So, I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit. I'm going to show you 2 events of music that we can kind of relate back to this, okay? The first one is music chunk melodic. And there's a fair bit of stuff on the screen, but for now, just look at, we know the transition markers, we've looked at those. We know destination markers. So all that's happening is it's going to, when we start playing this event, FMOD's logic tracks, just for those who are unaware, work top down. So it's going to go, hey, first, we've got a transition marker saying to take A. We've got probability set on, and there's a 50% chance that'll trigger. That has a 50% chance to work. If it doesn't, it's going to jump to the next thing below it, which is to take B, which is, again, 50% chance. Below that is zero probability, no, probability is off, so it's 100% chance it will trigger. So it's going to go, hey, FMOD is going to go, hey, do I trigger take A? No. Okay, take B? No. Okay, definitely C. Or it may say yes. So what it's going to do basically is pick a random one of these variations, play it, and then you can see we've got this final transition here called to end, and that's just going to jump the playback position from where we are just over to the right side so we don't continuously trigger the other elements as well. Okay? Because if that wasn't there, we'd play A and then continue playing straight through to B, and we don't want that. Ignoring the command instruments for now. That was neat. Play the first one. Right. Did I break something? No? Wow, the likelihood of that. Anyway, so now we've re-triggered it and we get part C, part A. But one key difference, solo violin didn't trigger. Because if we select the solo violin instruments and open up the sound components properties, you can see we've got probability is on and set to 70%. So the violin is only 70% likely to trigger, which means that the lead may or may not play, which means we get a kind of nice underscore version every now and then as well. Just a really cheap way to get a little bit more variation out of these elements. The laptop is not happy with me. Okay. Now, lastly, we've got these command instruments. What a command instrument can do is it can either set or increment a parameter or start or stop another event. For now, we're just going to be dealing with parameter setting from these. There are some other things you can do, like I said, starting and stopping parameters, but I'll keep that out of this. Events, sorry, starting and stopping events. But I'm going to keep that out of this demo. For now, we're just setting global parameters. For those who don't know, there's local and global parameters in FMOD. Local is basically purely within this event, and each event has its own instance of that parameter. Global means that that value that the parameter is, every event that references it has that same, it inherits that same parameter. Value, I'm sorry. So, in this case, when we start, you can see on each of these markers, we've got set parameter, music played to 0. Okay? That's going to be kind of important for later on. Then, because I'm cheeky, in the transition timeline, we have another command instrument that's saying set music played to 1. Okay? And that's in these 2 transition timelines as well. So, we have the event starts playing, it picks one of the takes, it then goes set music played to 0, and then once it's done, it sets music played to 1. And that's a global parameter. Okay? We also have these other command instruments that are setting synth volume. We've got the first one is set to 1, and the second and third ones are set to 0. So the Sorry, I can feel my mic slipping. We can set the, we've got synth volume set to 0 for the second 2 takes. So, what that means is any event that plays this event will now receive a message from this event saying, hey, music played has been set to 0 once this event starts. And then once the musical element stops, it'll receive another notification setting music played to 1. Okay? With me? So now if we jump on to another type of event. So this is the same kind of thing. I just want an event that will play a chunk of music, right? We now have this BGM chunk tension. And what I've got here is there's 4 variations of stems, right? So they're just compositional variants, 1, 2, 3, and 4. But what I wanted to do was kind of recreate a little bit of an aleatoric composition or chance composition, where basically each stem is going to pick one of those variations at random. So we might get violin playing variation 1, we might get high strings playing variation 3, I don't know. So every time we trigger that, we get a different combo. So that's violin 1, high and low strings 3. And you can see we've got our command instruments that are doing the same thing. Music played to 0 at the start, music played to 1 at the end. And in this case, we want the synth to play. Because, trust me, I know you have no frame of reference to what that means yet. Sit with me. Trigger that again, different combo of any of the 4 takes. So this would be the same as an orchestra being cued to play different elements within a film score. They used a similar technique for Harvey Dent's theme in The Dark Knight. It was all aleatoric chunks of music that they just triggered to play at random points. And to do this in FMOD, it was insanely easy. I just dropped each one of the stems into a multi-instrument. Okay. Let's breathe for a minute and recap. So we know we have 2 music events. The music events start playing some piece of music. They set music played to 0 when they start, and then when we've told FMOD, hey, it's finished, set music played to 1, right? And that will get inherited by any event that plays these events. So, what if we were to take another multi-instrument in another another event layer, another element of time, and then use that time to trigger and re-trigger which one's playing? Bear with me. First off, if we think about logically what we want to do, ignore the time, ignore the things. All we want to do is, in some way, we want to have an event that plays one of those 2 events, and then once it's done, once it's finished playing that musical element, it picks another one, right? Yeah, that's easy, yeah? Well, multi-instrument, great. We know multi-instruments can pick one of the elements that are inside at random, so we can add referenced events inside multi-instruments. So why don't we just add both at the BGM chunk elements that we made and put them into a multi-instrument. So now if we play this, it's going to pick either the melodic element or the tension element at random. Tension, melodic. It'll just randomly pick one or the other, right? Now, every time it does that, it will re-trigger all of the logic that we've embedded in those tracks. So again, we've done a lot of stuff, but basically we know, to summarize, tension is going to pick a random assortment of stems to play, melodic is going to pick one of the 3 melodic elements to play. We're now just picking one of those 2 options. Don't worry about the rest, we've done it, you can forget about it. Multi-instrument is pick one of those 2. And then we're just doing a little trick. We don't, to basically reset the playback position, so we can re-trigger this instrument. To start with, I've got the multi-instrument set to asynchronous, which basically means that it will continue to play as long as the playback position is not, it will continue to play when the playback position is not over the instrument region, and then it will stop once that one's initial take is done. So in other words, it will play an element, and then that instrument will just keep playing until the content inside is finished. If it was a normal audio file, it would finish that audio file and then stop. Asynchronous technically means that it's spawning its own timeline and running on that, but that's tech talk. So we then trigger this sound, and then at the end we've got this blue flag, and that's called a sustain point. And that's literally grabbing hold of the playback position and keeping it in place until we say, okay, you can let go now. And then we have a magnet region, which we know magnet regions pull the playback position to the start of that region, or the offset if it's set to offset mode, whenever that value is set to true, right? So we can trigger this. Now, when we trigger this, we set up all those parameters, right? We have music played gets set to 0 when we start playing, and then when the musical element is finished, we told it to set music played to 1. That seems useful, does it not? So we can go, okay, if the sustain point, if the music played is set to 0, hold on to the playback position. So in other words, if it's set to 1, let go. Then the magnet region, if music played is set to 1, snap the playback position back to the magnet region. So we go, music played is 0 because we started. Sustain point holds it. Music play got set to 1 by the element that we triggered inside, which caused the playback position to get let go from the transition to the sustain point, snap back to the magnet region, re-trigger the multi-instrument, and pick the next element. So now we have a single event that is randomly picking a new element of music every time that we told it to. So we can say, hey, this element of music is 2 bars, this one's 16, this one's 8. As long as we set it up inside with these here, as long as we set up those command instruments, that logic will now flow through the entire structure that we've built. So now this is what? 1, 2, 2, 3, 2 timelines deep. We jump up one again. Now all we need to do is trigger that event that we made, right? Because now whenever we play, that whole chunk is now just playing. But now we can also trigger the synth track along the bottom. And then, whoops, we can add some automation based on synth volume, that other elusive parameter that we set. So now, based on the cues that we've written and that we've assigned all these different command instruments and parameters to, we're literally cueing the synth to start or stop. This one has synth volume set to 0, so the synth volume is 0. Now to smoothen that out, you can just left click on synth volume in the master event and just increase the seek speed. That means that when it eventually gets set to 1 or 0, instead of snapping, it will just slowly blend up to it, which you should see in a sec once this re-triggers. There you go. And now this will just keep playing and loop until we tell it to stop. Which brings me to the last point of this event, which is doing something after a certain amount of time. The last element. So far we've talked about multiple time, we've talked about duplication of time, we've talked about modulation over time. What about something after a certain amount of time? In other words, a really common effect is, hey, after an event has been playing for a certain amount of time, pause for a little bit, right? That happens a lot in big games where they go, here's some ambient music, and then just dissipate into just the ambience for a while because the listener gets fatigued. So, to keep it really simple, we have a transition region, which is going to silence. The transition region will trigger to silence if music paused is set to 1. And that's quantized to every second bar, just so we don't trigger that too frequently. You'll see why in a minute. If it takes that, it will jump to the silence loop, and then we've just got a 4-bar fade out there, just so kind of, if the music's playing, it will just, slowly fade out. which I can simulate. Music, pause, which we set to here, I think. There we go. Of course, the strings didn't trigger, but it will slowly fade itself out once it finishes. It's just a way to kind of, there you go, see? It gently kind of dissipates away. And that's just jumping into this region here. And then what's going to happen is the playback position will just continually loop within this region. We have another command instrument at the end of that loop region that's trying to set music pause to 0, which has a 30% chance to trigger, which means every time it's looped, it may trigger music pause, it may not. Just a little bit more randomization. So basically, it's going to play this. Once music pause is set to 0, how I hear you scream, wait. Once the transition happens, we jump to the silence loop. Silence triggers nothing, fades out the music, and then 30% chance every 4 bars to jump back to the start again, just to kind of, give it a break. Lastly, we have a command instrument, yet again, setting the parameter music pause to 1. But I've been cheeky. And if you right-click that chance value that we've been relying on so very heavily for this talk, you can automate it. So I've added a curve on the timeline. And now I've just copy-pasted that command instrument multiple times. You can see as I move towards the end of this timeline, the chance of this command instrument is increasing each time based on this timeline curve, because they all inherit that same timeline curve. So now, this happens to be 2 minutes in. Once this music has been playing for 2 minutes, it will set itself to 100% likelihood that the pause will happen. So after 2 minutes, it definitely will pause, and then it'll loop back when it's ready to. How are we all doing?
I think for the most part, they're either extremely lost or totally on top of it, because the questions, not too many questions. Okay. But I do have one here. Actually, a couple about the sustain point.
Yeah.
Maybe one, just to start off, why do you need the sustain point? Can't you just let the marker float off into the infinity of the timeline?
Yes. It looks nicer for the demo if it stays there, that's all. Okay, the actual answer is, so you can definitely let this continue off, but FMOD's default functionality is that once it knows there's no more content to play, it will stop playing the event, which is what we're relying on for these different BGM chunks, right? If we were to, down the line, add, say, a 1-bar element of music, there's a chance that because this sustain point is over here, let's say let's say that the music is shorter than let's say that the music is shorter than the distance to that sustain point, then there's a chance that FMOD may de-trigger that event. So it's kind of just a safeguard to do that. I could also have very easily just turned persistent on, which means this event won't just stop playing once there's no more content as well. So both ways are completely valid. The sustain point way does work as well, but yes, you're completely right. It is not necessary. It just looks nice.
Also another question asking if there's any logic behind the position of the sustain point, whether it could be directly after the multi-instrument, but...
Yeah, it definitely could as well, but as I said, it's not, it's not entirely necessary to really have it there, but it doesn't really matter where it is, it's just a way to hold the playback position sort of still, but yeah, it's not necessary.
One question here. When you have music separated into section stems, could or would you put those stems through a master bus with effects in FMOD?
Yes, for sure. We have something similar here. Ignoring the transceiver, we have a bunch of effects that is happening here, and then I'm sending music to this bus. This one is a bit of a deep dive, but unless people are really keen to see what's happening. So the short version of what I'm doing here is sending the audio from the 2D music to a bus in the mixer, and then creating a sidechain from that bus. And then I am turning down the 2D music event, so the bass one. And then this is a spatialized event that we can see in the game that we're using the positional information of to drive the volume. Like I said, deep dive. Come see us, it's really cool. But you can see here we've got music running into this track, and then there's a series of effects and things. We've got EQ, distortion, pitch shifting and whatnot, which is all being driven on the master fader of this event. So totally doable. The one thing just to think about while using effects is just that certain effects have different performance impacts, so it is important to be aware of what you're kind of adding and how. But for the most part, we try to keep things as optimized as we can for you.
Another question here. This works great on longer loops. Are there any tricks for shorter loops?
Yeah, so you're right, and that's what I kind of mentioned in a lot of these, that this particular demo is kind of long form because frankly it's easier to drive a project like that. When it's really short, snappy things, it's quite hard to talk and change all the parameters at the same time. But to keep things more interactive, we've got the quantization levels that you can bring down to a minimum of an eighth note currently. So you can trigger the quantization at intervals of an eighth note, which is super snappy and really mostly what people would really get down to. And then compositionally, I would suggest using elements that have a lot of like percussive elements or things that let you kind of blend between the beats that you're on as well. So especially if you're planning to like skip beats or go from like a 4-bar, 4/4 piece and then transition at like beat 3, then having something that may have a little bit of, not necessarily polyrhythms, but at least accenting different elements of it so that the player is not so locked into like a 4/4 groove. Something like the battle theme that we had earlier that is, even though it's a 4/4 groove, there's a lot of syncopation happening within the drums, which makes it kind of easy to snap in and out, right? Particularly over here. So I would suggest just kind of thinking about transient elements, thinking about when you want to transition, and also think about why you may need something to transition really snappily. It may not always be necessary to just react immediately. Sometimes slowly evolving can really paint a better emotional picture from what you're trying to do in the score. So it's really important to think about why you want it to be fast.
There's actually a composition question here that I thought might skip over, as this is like quite a tool-focused talk, but leads in very nicely. When writing music, do you consider transition points in the score itself?
Yes.
Great.
Yes. So I'm a very big advocate of the fact that implementation is part of the orchestration process and mixing is part of the orchestration process. Compositionally speaking, in my opinion, all these elements are the same. You wouldn't orchestrate a piece by just going, hey, strings do this, right? You'd look at it and go, and it's the violins do this, violas do this, cellos, double bass do this. You would orchestrate it in a way that you're organizing it and controlling these elements, right? It's the same with even if it was a band. You wouldn't just say, hey guys, play an A chord. You'd pick who's doing what. It's the same for implementation of music. We should be thinking about what we want to do when. And as soon as you start thinking about that, that starts inherently affecting the compositional process because you go, oh, okay, well, I don't need to make it super melodic and super catchy in the start of the intro because I know it's going to kick into the second part really quickly. So you can suddenly go, great, all I need to do is set the groove, set the vibe at the start of this, and then the melody. And that's exactly what happened here, right? It starts playing that loop, and then that low growl melody kicks in. Compositionally, you're like, oh, that's cool. It's like kicking in, ramping up, right? It's the same here. If we go play. So it's just setting that grungy kind of intense vibe. You go, okay, cool, we've made our point. Musically, it's just doing its thing. And then we can loop into it. Now it feels like we've lifted up, but we haven't added anything except that low brass. compositionally speaking, I could have easily stuck those two together, right? I could have easily just gone one into the other. And it would have kind of made sense. But dynamically, I was going, okay, I need to separate this out. And that gave me a lot more freedom in terms of deciding what I want to add where in the composition. So, yeah, I think totally, all of these elements should be integrated together. I think you should be thinking about mixing while you're composing. If something doesn't feel like it sits right, if you're into the orchestral stuff, then if something feels like it's not sitting right, then maybe it's not just about turning it up. Maybe pull the dynamics back. Maybe make it feel a little bit more believable. Maybe make it feel like it's realistically what's happening. Think about acoustically what's happening there. Same with bands, same with compositional elements. And then bring that element into the integration, going, well, if this was to dynamically react into the game, what would happen? And how would that sound? And the intensity value of this element here is a great example of exactly that, right? So what I'm doing with this intensity value is I've created something called an effect preset, which are amazing, by the way. I would highly recommend looking into them for FMOD. And we have a gain, which is being controlled with the music intensity value, and then we have an EQ that's being controlled with the intensity value as well. Then on the core, we've got that same effect preset, but we've also got a low pass, high pass, and a delay, and they're doing their own thing, all being modulated by the music intensity. We've got the orchestra, which has the same effect preset, but we're also adding a little bit of extra gain reduction on that. And the melody is purely just a slight amount of gain reduction. So each stem has its own organic little extra touch to it. And what that means is that when we're playing, I'm almost treating this more like a contact instrument in that I'm opening and closing the filter on the synth. The EQ is rolling off just the bass and high frequency intensities as well as a little bit of the high mids. So when I'm pushing this, feels a lot more organic than just turning something up and down because we're adjusting the frequencies. Now, if I was just thinking about implementation, I would have just turned it up and down. I didn't want that. I was thinking compositionally, I want it to feel like it pulls back. And the great thing about this, because we've got this effect preset, we can kind of kick it in and go, great, well, even for this really intense section, that same intensity value still works. Right? So again, if I was just thinking about composition, like composing it and then implementing it generically, I wouldn't have thought of those elements. So yes, very, very important to integrate all three of those in your compositional process. I think I'm run over time.
Yes, we started early. We are running late. There is one more question that has been asked in about 4 different ways, so
Okay.
I feel like I have to ask it.
Okay.
Are there any great certification or comprehensive tutorial series that you recommend to new users? Or is there a file or template like this provided by FMOD that people can play around with?
Sure. So we do have tutorials that are being developed at the moment, but being worked on and very close to finishing the onboarding set of tutorials. We also have the fantastic FMOD project for Celeste is available for free download off our website. You can break down that whole project and look at all the things that they did. They did an amazing job in that one. And then anything else is, yeah, we've got our tutorials coming up. There's a bunch of really good people on YouTube that do some fantastic tutorials. There's Sergio, I can't remember his last name right now. Alessandro Farmer is also a great resource as well. He's done some amazing tutorials. So look, there's a bunch around out there. If anybody has had a look around and still feels stuck, feel free to reach out to us on the forums, or even just email me at aaron@fmod.com, which I probably should have had a slide for, but and yeah, feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to point in the right direction and help out however I can.
And you also have the next 58 minutes to check out the FMOD room and Aaron in person for the rest of your questions,
Sure.
which have
We'd love to see
suddenly
you.
flowed in right at the very end, which is rude of you, honestly.
Also, I do just want to say thank you to CMI and JBL for helping us set up the amazing 5.1 system downstairs. They did a really good job at helping us get that all up and running, and the JBL speakers down there are phenomenal. So big thanks to those guys, and you can check them out here as well in their demo room as well.
Thanks so much, Aaron.
Thanks, everyone.